In the year 1525, during the reign of King Carlos I, there was a small coastal village in Spain named Puerto Alba. It was a quiet place where the waves whispered its secrets to the shore, and the townspeople lived their simple lives by the grace and wrath of the sea. Among them was a widow named Rosa Maria Navarro, a woman once full of life, now burdened by sorrow. Though baptized as Rosa Maria, those closest to her simply called her Mary, a name she embraced since childhood. Her husband had been a sailor, lost to the ocean years before. It had stolen from her, leaving her alone to raise her two children, Mateo, 13, and Isabel, 11. Despite her grief, she poured every ounce of love into her children, swearing to protect them as fiercely as she could. Yet, the sea was a cruel mistress, and it was not finished taking from her. One afternoon, while the sun hung high over Puerto Alba, Rosa Maria sat on the beach with her children. Mary refused to let her fear of the ocean infect her children. They lived next to the ocean. She would not let them live their lives afraid. They laughed and played near the waves while she sat on a smooth rock, staring into the small mirror she carried, a delicate silver handled piece, a gift from her husband before his final voyage. She traced the lines of her face, lost in thought for just a moment. Then she heard it, the sound of her children's laughter turning to screams. She looked up to see Mateo and Isabel being pulled out to the sea. The undercurrent had caught them, dragging them away faster than their small bodies could fight. Mary screamed, dropping the mirror onto the sand as she ran towards the water. She swam as hard as she could, calling their names, but the waves swallowed them whole. She fought against the water, searching desperately, but exhaustion and grief overwhelmed her. The ocean, as it had done once before, took everything from her. The villagers dragged her from the waves, barely conscious. Her children were gone. From that day forward, Mary was never the same. She wandered the beach in a simple white dress, once beautiful, now tattered by the wind and salt. She clutched the broken remains of her mirror, whispering to it, "Come back to me. Let me see you again." Her feet bled from the jagged rocks, but she did not care. Her only thoughts were for her children. Every night she carved new wounds into her skin with the shards of her mirror, punishing herself for failing them. The people of Puerto Alba pitied her, but were also afraid of her. They spoke of her in hushed voices, calling her Bloody Maria for the deep gashes on her arms, the crimson stains that spread across her once white dress. But the villagers also tried to help her. Once, they took her away from the beach, cleaned her wounds, and kept her inside a warm home for several days. But as soon as they let her go, she returned to the shore, resuming her endless walk along the tide's edge. Her grief was too deep, her mind too far gone. One stormy night, Rosa Maria walked into the sea. The wind carried her cries one last time. The next morning, there was no trace of her. Only her broken mirror remained, half buried in the sand. But whispers of her presence were all around. The legend spread quickly through Puerto Alba and then beyond. They said that on quiet nights, when the wind was still, you could hear her calling, "Mateo, Isabel," along the beach. Fishermen claimed they would sometimes see a ghostly image of a woman in white walking the beach, her cries carrying out to them on their boats. Then, young girls in Puerto Alba began whispering her name in front of mirrors, daring one another to say it 3 times. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. At first, nothing would happen, but then the glass would darken. A shadow would appear, taking shape. A woman in a white dress, her eyes hollow, her face streaked with blood, her fingers jagged and sharp, reaching out. Once she laid eyes on you and realized you weren't her children, a furious scream tore from her lips. Before she vanished, she would slash deep scratches into the faces of the ones who summoned her, just as she had once done to herself. And so she walked still. Her children were lost to the sea, but she still searches. When she hears her name, she turns towards the voice, hoping, praying, only to be disappointed again. If you say her name 3 times in the dark, standing before a mirror, beware. She will come. The first time the villagers heard the music, it drifted in from the darkness like a half-remembered lullaby. A slow, winding tune played on an old barrel organ, each note grinding out with wheezy, mechanical precision. The sound was eerie yet beautiful, like a melody plucked from a dream. The organ grinder had arrived. No one remembered his name. Years ago he had been one of them, a poor musician who lived on the village outskirts. They whispered that his music carried strange magic, that the melodies he played could weave dreams or stir forgotten sorrows. Some swore they heard voices in the notes. Others claimed the songs called to things best left undisturbed. Fear turned to scorn, and scorn to cruelty. The townspeople had shunned him, mocked him, called him cursed. When his only son had died of illness, rather than show pity, they whispered that it was a punishment, that no man so strange was meant to keep a child. Alone, hated, he vanished. 4 years passed, and most had already forgotten about the organ grinder. Now he was back. The organ grinder pushed his battered instrument on a wooden cart. A tattered red cloak draped over his wide shoulders, his face partially hidden beneath his hat. Children were the first to follow. They trailed behind as the organ grinder wound his way through the village square, dropping copper coins into a tin cup hanging off the barrel handle. Each time a child dropped a copper coin into it, the organ grinder paused for a brief moment, then turned the crank with a practiced hand, letting the organ sing a few bright, cheerful notes, a small, wordless thank you carried on the wind. That first night, the organ grinder set up near the inn, playing his hypnotic melodies until the last candle had gone dark. The villagers, lulled by the strange yet soothing tunes, slept soundly. By morning, 2 children were missing. The search parties found nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, no sign that the children ever left their beds. The organ grinder said nothing as the mayor questioned him. He simply stood by his cart, hands resting on the organ's worn handle. When pressed, he merely tipped his hat, revealing a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. That night, the music returned. The villagers swore they would not listen. They barred their doors, closed their shutters, whispered prayers beneath their breath. But the tune seeped through the cracks, curling into their dreams like smoke. One by one, doors creaked open. By morning, 4 more children were gone. Panic set in. The mayor ordered the organ grinder seized, but the moment the villagers rushed forward, the organ grinder turned the handle of his instrument, and the music changed. No longer a lullaby, now a waltz, faster, louder, a feverish, dizzying rhythm. The villagers staggered as if struck by an invisible force. Their limbs twitched, their feet shuffled, their bodies swayed against their will. The dance had begun. The music controlled them now, forcing them into a cursed dance. They spun in circles, clapping their hands, their faces locked in grotesque grins, their bodies jerked and twisted, their movements growing wilder, more erratic. Invisible strings pulled them in time with the malevolent melody. They tried to stop, but they couldn't. They danced, and An hour passed, then another. They danced until their legs gave out. One by one they collapsed, their bodies twitching, their breath ragged, their eyes rolling back into their heads. And then, darkness. When they awoke, it was morning, and every child in the village was gone. The organ grinder was nowhere to be found. A search party was sent out, but there was no trace of the children. The village emptied over time, its people too broken to remain. One night, in a city on the other side of the country, townspeople heard a beautiful note float out on the evening's breeze. A slow, winding melody played on an old barrel organ. Drawn by the sound, a man followed the music into the shadows of a narrow alley, where a group of children stood huddled around a familiar figure. They wore fine clothes now, their hair neatly combed, their eyes vacant. Each carried a small leather pouch at their waist. A passerby tossed a coin. The tallest child stepped forward, caught it in midair, and with a bow slipped it into the pouch. Then, as one, the children turned. Their eyes, clouded and unfocused, saw nothing. Blind to the world, they moved like puppets, guided only by the organ grinder's song. The factory was always empty at night. During the day, the vast building hummed with the sounds of machinery, chatter, and the steady rhythm of production. But after hours, it was a hollow shell, filled only with the echoes of the day. Gabe Mendoza had worked as the night security guard for years. Nobody else was there at night, so he had free run of the place. He knew every hallway, every office, every flickering fluorescent light. The place had its quirks, occasional electrical hiccups, creaking vents, the distant clang of settling metal. But lately, things had felt different, off. As he made his rounds, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He entered a long, dimly lit hallway lined with old storage rooms. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust. As he passed a door, a faint shuffling noise echoed from within. He stopped. Gripping his flashlight, he grabbed the door handle and turned slowly. The door creaked open into darkness. He reached in and flipped a light switch on. Inside, shelves cast long shadows across the concrete floor. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound drifted through the air. He aimed his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Just rows of old supplies and forgotten equipment. The tapping stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He swallowed hard and took a slow step back. Without warning, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Gabe whirled around, his pulse hammering in his ears. He reached for the handle, hesitating, his breath shallow. After a brief moment, he yanked it open, expecting to see something, anything. But the hallway outside was empty, just as he had left it. No movement, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the dim, flickering overhead lights casting long, shifting shadows. His breath came quick, but he pressed on. In another section of the factory, a double door leading to the break room was open when it should have been closed. The vending machines hummed softly. The fluorescent light flickered as he stepped inside. The room was empty, except for a single cup of coffee sitting on one of the break room tables, steam still rising from its surface. Gabe tensed, his eyes scanning every corner, but there was no sign of anyone. No footsteps, no movement, just the quiet drip of a leaky faucet in the background. A chill ran through him as he backed out, leaving the door open behind him, the untouched coffee still steaming in the silence. His nerves were fraying, his hands shook slightly, and his breathing came in uneven bursts. He needed a place to calm down, somewhere well lit and close to the entrance. The main office on the first floor, that was his best option. Readying himself, he made his way there. The scent of fresh flowers wafted through the air. A small bouquet sat on the receptionist's desk, lilies and roses. Funny, he didn't remember seeing those when he started his shift. His gaze drifted to the desk where a phone sat in its cradle. The red light on the answering machine blinked. Curious, he pressed play. A woman's voice filled the empty room, thick with sorrow. "Hey everyone, I just wanted to say thanks again for coming today. I know he would have appreciated it. It felt strange this morning not seeing him in his usual spot, like he should have been there, finishing up his shift as we walked in. I guess we have to get used to that. Anyway, take care everyone." Gabe frowned, his pulse quickening. Who were they talking about? A chill crawled up his spine. He left the office and continued his rounds, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. The factory's meeting room was next. As he stepped inside, the overhead light flickered. There were trays of leftover food on some of the tables. On a table at the head of the room, there were a stack of postcards. He picked one up. His breath caught in his throat. In loving memory of Gabe Mendoza, his own face stared back at him, framed by a black border. The dates confirmed it. He had died 3 days ago. His hand trembled as he dropped the card. The room seemed to tilt around him. He staggered back, knocking over a chair. A rising dread filled him, an overwhelming weight pressing down as he turned in frantic circles. He tried to escape, but the hall stretched endlessly, warping around him, leading him back, always back. The break room, the table, the cards, his name staring at him, sealing him inside a moment that would never pass. Somewhere, far away, the world moved on without him. He was nothing more than a shadow in the periphery, a sigh in the empty corridors. And still, his shift went on, never ending.